I'm ready. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Mount Vernon District SSPA Task Force meeting Tuesday, July 13th, 2021. I'm Planning Commissioner Walter Clark, along with Planning Commissioner Mr. Tim Sargent, and we are your co-chairs for the task force for any of you that may be joining this call for the first time. To conduct this meeting wholly electronically and effectuate both the emergency procedures authorized by FOIA and the emergency ordinance, the Mount Vernon District SSPA Task Force needs to make certain findings and determinations for the record. It's a bit cumbersome, so I ask you in advance for your patience. First, because each member of the task force is participating in this meeting from separate locations, we must verify that a quorum of members is participating and each member's voice is clear, audible, and at appropriate volume for all of the other members. Accordingly, I am going to conduct a roll call and ask each task force member participating in this meeting to state your name and location from which you are participating. I ask that each of you pay close attention to ensure that you can hear each of your colleagues. Following the roll call, we will vote to establish that every member can hear every other member. So the roll call, Ms. Catherine Ward.
Excuse me, present in my home on Gladstone Place.
Lynn Pasco.
Yeah, present in my home in Montebello.
Gretchen Waltz.
Home here on New Market Road in Holland Hall Village.
Ellen Young.
I am here at home in Bellevue.
Evan Kaufman. Evan. Queenie Cox. Holly Doherty. Hillary Clausen. I saw Hillary.
Yeah, Hillary was here.
Hillary's here. Where did she go?
Can you say her name again?
Hillary Clausen. We'll come back to Hillary. David Levine.
Yeah, hi. I'm present here in my office in Alexandria.
Okay, and if the others join, Aaron, you'll let us know if you see the others that will join.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. At this point, I will pass the virtual gavel to the co-chairman so that I may be heard to make the requisite motion. As co-chair, I move that each member's voice may be adequately heard by each other member of the Mount Vernon District SSPA Task Force.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second. This is Ellen.
Seconded by Ellen. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
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 Anyone
Aye.
opposed? Anyone opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes.
Second, having established that each member's voice may be heard by every other member, we must next establish the nature of the emergency that compels this emergency procedures. The fact that we are meeting electronically, what type of electronic communication is being used, and how we have arranged for public access to this meeting. Therefore, I move that the state of emergency caused by COVID-19 pandemic makes it unsafe for the task force to physically assemble and unsafe for the public to physically attend any such meeting, and that at such FOIA usual procedures, which require the physical assembly of the task force and the physical presence of the public, cannot be implemented safely or practically. I further move that the task force may conduct this meeting electronically through the dedicated video and audio conferencing line, and the public may access the meeting by registering through the meeting link on the Track a Plan Amendment page of SSPA website at fairfax.gov/planning-development/south/track-plan-amendment, or by calling 1-844-621-3956 TTY 711 and entering the access code. It is so moved.
Do I hear a second?
Second, Gretchen.
Gretchen has seconded the motion. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? The motion passes.
Finally, it is next required that all of the matters addressed on today's agenda must address the emergency itself, are necessary for the continuity in Fairfax County government, and or are statutorily required or necessary to continue operations and the discharge of the Mount Vernon District SSPA task forces, lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. It is so moved.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Second, Flynn.
Okay, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes.
Okay, fantastic. Do we have a few other the task force members to join us since the roll call? Did Hillary come back? Did we? No, I'm not seeing it.
We saw Hillary Clausen earlier. Did she drop off?
She's on the call, but maybe she stepped away.
Okay.
Okay.
She liked Catherine's idea and had to get some.
Yes, I went
Wait
and got a
minute.
second one.
Oh, jeez. All right. So moving along with the agenda, before we do that, since our last meeting, I'll ask Aaron or ask staff, since this is a public open meeting, are there any comments that's been received since our last meeting that we need to address now in advance, or any notes received?
No,
I haven't received
Okay.
I haven't received any comments as of this evening. Aaron, have you received any comments?
no.
Okay, thank you very much. If we can proceed with the agenda, what's next on the agenda? If we could ask staff to kind of set the tone for us a little bit here.
So next on the agenda is the urban design and transit-oriented design presentation by DPD staff.
Okay, I guess I'm up. My name is Joanne Phoebe. I think I know many of you. I've been the revitalization program manager for the Richmond Highway Corridor now for almost 5 years. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to present to you all tonight and really make this an open discussion where we have more of a dialogue and a narrative and more of a robust discussion than maybe some other presentations. So prior to coming to the county, my background's in urban design and architecture. And so to me, this is really my passion and what I love to do. And so I hope that I can impart some of the joy and excitement of what urban design is to you all, and that maybe some of these ideas will translate into the final plan as it starts to come to fruition. But I'm going to go ahead and actually, Aaron, I'm no longer the presenter. So let's see here. Just want to get that access so I can pull up some slides. Maybe while Aaron's doing that, I'll just share a little bit about, to me, why urban design is important to planning. You know, I see it as the sort of choreography that brings together all of the design aspects of a development of a community. I think it's a discipline that overlaps many of the planning related fields, be it land use, transportation, public works, landscape architecture, parks and architecture. And so I see it as really, like I said, the choreography that sort of draws all those different ideas together and brings it together to create a place. So with that, I will pull up this presentation. Let me see here.
Hey, Aaron, so to make Joanne a presenter, what you're gonna want to do, if you haven't already, is, oh, she got it, never mind.
Yep, I got it. Okay. And this little thing is in the way. There we go. Okay. Let me start at the beginning here. All right. So as I was getting started, I think for tonight's presentation, I wanted to run through a few things. I was going to start with just talking about some general urban design principles that relate to, really could consider for a lot of more urban sites, like a metro station. And then I know I've heard a lot of discussion and sort of interest in the Eisenhower East metro station. I think I've heard maybe from Supervisor Stork that, there's some high quality design there and some ideas that we should at least be thinking through. So I went and talked with the principal planner, actually Graham and I did, and learned a little bit about the most recent plan update. So I wanted to share some of the, maybe kind of as a case study that we can talk through a little bit on what are maybe some of the successes and challenges that they're dealing with. And then I thought we'd look at the Huntington site in particular and go through some of the context and then talk about some challenges and opportunities with the site. And we'll try to, document and log some of those things. And hopefully this is sort of a little bit of a visioning or taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture ideas for the site. Because really, ultimately, what we want to try to do is understand what kind of human experience we want to create here. And if we create places that are really desirable for people, then all of the desired land uses and the things we want to achieve will come. But it needs to be a great place. So I promise you there'll be very few slides with text, but I just wanted to start off by speaking to me what urban design is, as I've sort of already mentioned. But it's both the designs of buildings and then the public spaces and the spaces between those buildings, and the establishing of the frameworks around the built environment and the ground plane to deliver a successful development. And I hope that it inspires how a place could be improved. And in our comprehensive plan, urban design represents often the area's urban design values by illustrating the vision for a visual character of a place. And as I said, defining the space between buildings and then guiding the design of the building form and envelope. So I'm hearing a little bit of echo, so I'm trying to work around that. So these are what I see as urban design principles that, while this is not codified in the comprehensive plan anywhere as this particular list, over time I've pulled these elements out as from various plans. But when you hear about, when I see urban design principles written into the plan, I think this sort of collectively documents a lot of those elements. And so I'll just run through these because this is going to set up sort of the framework of the elements that I want to talk about tonight. But I think first and foremost, as I was mentioning, this idea of defining a sense of place that's welcoming for all. And that's really like, what is that human experience that we want to achieve on the site? Then if you look at the next layer, it's really looking at that, establishing that street network. We have existing streets. How do we augment that with new streets? To create a walkable grid and place that works for transportation, but also for people. And then, of course, layered onto that is providing great equitable public spaces, then developing and starting to think about the architecture, and that delves into building heights, parking. Parking is, well, we don't want to talk about it, but it so often drives design decisions. Then thinking about the context, both the natural and the human context, as well as the historical elements that make a place distinctive. And I actually want to talk very briefly, and I'm wondering, maybe there's a history buff among us, but this site actually has a lot of rich history dating back to pre-Civil War. thinking about this mix of uses that focuses on economic vitality and promoting a walkable environment, employing of various modes of transportation that's focused on people-centered street design, and then thinking about the environment and sustainable design. So community character is something that we can't sit here and define and say, okay, the community is going to, you know, look exactly like this and is going to draw these certain kinds of people and you know, this is going to be the experience. But again, if we create that human-centered experience, we're going to draw the kinds of people we want. So one of the things I do want to talk about later is, who are we designing the site for? You know, is this for the transit riders? Is this for creating a new community? You know, who are the users of the site? And that will lead into ideas about placemaking, which focuses on the physical, cultural, and social identities that define a place. And placemaking is this sort of amorphous term that people throw around a lot. But I think it really is important as we're starting to think about the early stages of a vision for a site. And I heard an architect speak about placemaking as really being thinking about three main elements that make up placemaking. First, the people that live in and contribute to the place. And then secondly, the businesses and uses that are found within it. So much of the time we define places by the businesses that are around. And you know, when we think about great places, we think about local stores and unique restaurants and that kind of experience, which is so hard these days to cultivate because of the changing nature of retail and those kinds of challenges. And then the last is physical design. You know, what are these kinds of spaces that we're trying to create? Are they populated with people, or do they feel desolate? You know, are there quirky opportunities too to you know, just have different kinds of experiences? So another element of character and building place is really thinking about this overall urban form. And this is, of course, on the left, the example of, this is Rockefeller Center, which I think is a really great example of urban form. When we're talking about that, we're talking about the physical form of buildings, you know, how they're shaped by the site, and then how they often shape the skyline and the spaces around them. So I thought this was a beautiful example of that on the right, which is the Roslyn comprehensive plan. Has, you know, speaks to this procession of buildings and spaces in order to create a series of views and vistas that's centralized around the metro station, and really both defines, as I was talking about, when you really think about fundamentally urban design, you're thinking about, you know, how these buildings shape the ground plane and the spaces that are, you know, that make up that human experience on the ground, and then those amazing spaces in between those buildings. Another element that often defines character, especially at metro stations, is the idea of a gateway. You know, this, especially on, like I said, corridors and transit stations, because they define the boundaries of a place. And when you think about gateways, you think about moving through something, you know. So this is an example, I think, of a really good gateway at Brookland Center, which is the Arts Walk. And, you know, it has a lot of these elements that I'm speaking to that also you think about placemaking, creating an anchor with landmarks and signage, which helps to benefit the commercial uses, because you've got this visibility and this, you know, everyone can say, you know, oh, meet me at the Arts Walk. We start to define that sense of place. Then the public spaces that are around that help to define that as well. This is something that I don't always talk about, but I think it's really important in this case because of the uniqueness of the Huntington site, is views and vistas. And yeah, this is probably one of the most famous examples in our country of Washington, D.C. But, you know, thinking it's more than just the Washington Monument and the National Lawn, the lawn. It's all of the elements that help to go in to frame that view. And I think there's some good examples even in the East Eisenhower plan with framing views towards the city of Alexandria. So, but we want to give that consideration in the overall layout and design of Huntington Metro, I think. So beyond character, as I was talking about those initial principles, the next is streets and blocks. And yeah, this is when we talk about walkable communities, it's really things like streetscapes and wide sidewalks and street trees and things. Those are important elements, but first and foremost, it's got to start off with a good block structure, because if you've got something that's short blocks, that's easy to navigate, that makes sense, it really defines a human-centered experience over one that's you can see on the left versus the right. You've got Old Town Alexandria, and what the area that's highlighted in the orange is how far you could get in about a 5-minute walk. And you can see how many blocks, how many street frontages, how many buildings you could access in that period of time. On the right is the Dunloring Metro, which has a lot of great attributes and is really being built out as a good metro station. But you can see the kind of haphazard grid stuff that was developed in the 1980s that's less walkable and grid-like versus Alexandria, and how much less you can really access in that same 5-minute walk shed. So, you know, when we talk about Huntington, we really want to think about that. What can we access within that 5-minute walk? Because that's often a good gauge. There's sort of the 5-minute walk, the 10-minute walk, and then you talk about like a 10-minute bike ride as those kind of scales of that are more human-centered versus car-oriented. And so I just brought this up because I would be remiss to not talk at all about the Embark plan, which was approved for Richmond Highway now a couple of years ago. And this is one of the central focuses of the Embark plan, was thinking about these portions of the CBC that are large shopping centers, such as the Beacon Center in Beacon Groveton. This is where the Home Depot is, and this is the Target. And, you know, currently it's a large parking lot and has that sort of auto-oriented shopping center experience, and we all drive there. And but in thinking about Embark, we thought about this alternate experience, which was centered on the BRT station, and broke down this large area into a series of blocks that are similarly scaled to places like Old Town Alexandria. You could see how much development you can yield when you break down the scale of things and shift parking into parking garages and go more vertical, rather than everything being a single story and surface parked. So, you know, this really sets up a walkable environment that frames open spaces and buildings, and really builds a lot of value in community and character, centered on a BRT station. And I would just also, so this relates to this idea about walkability and but block size and scale is probably the single most important element to creating a walkable environment. And I just wanted to share sort of 3 different versions of that, because a lot of times we'll say things like 250 feet is really fairly tiny, and it is, but if you actually, Portland, Oregon is built on a 250 by 250 foot grid. So, you know, on Richmond Highway, a lot of times we can't get under 500 feet. Well, that's really big. It's pretty hard to feel comfortable walking down the street and on a large grid like that. So that's equivalent to 4 of these blocks blocked together. And then just a couple other examples of our Alexandria and Arlington. I know there's going to be different challenges on our site, but I think it's just important for context and scale to understand these. Catherine, did you want to jump in? Because I don't want to do all the talking. I'd love for people to jump in and discuss some things.
This is Gretchen. I'll be glad to make a comment.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Was it maybe it was you who made the note?
No, I didn't make a note.
Okay.
But again, these are all lovely pictures, but from what we understand, there's a major highway going down the middle of this. So how is that going to make it walkable? How's that going to make it, you know, neighborhood friendly?
Are you talking about Richmond Highway?
Yeah,
Or we're talking about, oh, I'm sorry, because we're talking predominantly tonight about Huntington Metro
Okay.
Station, right? Yeah, but I agree with you. The challenge of Richmond Highway is a problem for creating that walkable experience. We've got
well,
the
only brought it up because
streetscapes.
you show these great little pictures. I'm like, well, that's not reality apparently, so.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, like I just went back a slide, this red line is Richmond Highway, and we can create that experience within the CBC, but then yes, we have to really think about what is this experience on Richmond Highway? How do you get between the CBCs to make this a connected neighborhood?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
Agreed.
that's the same issue going forward with Huntington.
Well, that's something I really do want to talk about tonight is what does North Kings look like in the future? What does Huntington Avenue look like? Are they going to continue to operate as thoroughfares and throughput, or are they really going to be part of developing this place and help to reconnect the metro station to the neighborhoods so that it all feels like one big community? I think that's a question for us. What kind of experience do we want along those roads?
Well, I had a discussion with someone who lives in Jefferson Manor across the way from the Huntington station, and up at the upper level, and they're like, well, that's great. It's going to look lovely across the street, and we can't even get sidewalks redone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have to think about not only the current project, but how does it affect our neighbors?
Definitely.
Could I follow up on that with just one question?
Sure.
This is all, again, very lovely to talk about, but along Richmond Highway, the road people have taken it over. And it seems to me you guys have been squeezed out of the picture. And so all of the nice, pretty picture we have of the highway and our main street and all of that is now turning into a 12-lane road that VDOT and FCDOT seem to have complete control over. What happened? I mean, that's worries me when you're talking about here or Huntington Avenue or other places. If the road people are going to do whatever the heck they want to do anyway, how do you guys play? I mean, we had a great deal of faith in you guys, and now we're pretty angry about what the thing's looking like.
I hear you. I mean, we've been involved in the design of Richmond Highway, and I don't want to get too off track, but I see the relevance to some of the streets that are associated with our site on Huntington. I mean, in this case, fortunately, we don't have a national highway route associated with the Huntington Transit Station site. We have two important streets, Huntington Avenue and North Kings, in terms of its relevance to VDOT's grid. But I think we have an opportunity, given that it's not a national highway route, to really think and make that a part of this plan at its formative stages. I think we should defer the discussion about Richmond Highway to something separate, because we could spend all night on that. Is that okay?
And Joanne, if I may, to both Gretchen and Lynn's point, I think the sentiment, I think we're with you on that. There is absolutely a balance to be had between the need for high quality neighborhoods that can be brought about by transit oriented development, and the need to mitigate the impacts of transportation, and part of that is through capacity. So I think that the question that you're raising is going to be one of the top three probably issues that we deal with, especially once we get the results of the transportation impact analysis back. So I in no way want to, I want to put a pin in it for this purposes of kind of urban design and the discussion we're going to have tonight, but that's specifically going to be one of the things that we look at the next meeting on the 20th, to just kind of set the stage for the transportation analysis and what they'll be looking at. And then once we get the results back, trying to see what can be done with the existing network. Last thing I'll say on this is, to Joanne's point is, both Huntington Avenue as well as North Kings, there's limited ability to widen, given the existing the existing development that's around it. So I think we're dealing with a different situation here where we can't just widen into we can't widen forever. So we'll need to have further conversations about that, and we're looking forward to it.
I'd like you to comment, please, on Joanne, on the vibrant streets concept that Street Sense created a number of years ago to help the city of DC figure out why some streets were actually very vibrant and active and things of that sort, and why others were dying. I personally have believed that both North Kings and Huntington Avenue, particularly Huntington Avenue, can be supported by the concept of vibrant streets. So could you address that for those who don't understand that concept or may not understand that concept, and then tell us what you guys are doing to use those tools that Street Sense has come up with?
Yeah, the Street Sense, which is a nationally recognized consulting firm, mostly on the idea of retail and placemaking, developed a toolkit for the city of DC to look at. DC has all this series of neighborhoods and their smaller scale main streets that occur within them, and how to ensure their long-term success. And they went through and looked at I think 26 different case studies around the world of what made a street vibrant, and a lot of it focused on the retail and the choreography of the different types of businesses and things on that street. But there are a whole host of elements that they looked at, everything from dare I say, utility undergrounding, to the width of the sidewalks, to the density of the residential that surround it, but ultimately things like having daytime and nighttime population, and the economic health of the neighborhood is really were critical elements in the success of certain streets versus others. But it comes down to design in a lot of these, and I think we do have that opportunity. In fact, so much so that Street Sense was hired by the Huntington Club just to the north of the site to look at the retail plan for it, and they are putting all of their retail right on Huntington Avenue, and they see that as the opportunity location on their site, particularly because North Kings has so much topography when you get in front of Huntington Club. But they're going to focus their retail along there, and so we need to think about, for Huntington Metro Station site, where is retail going to be most appropriate? Where is it going to be most successful? How do we continue maybe some of the success of the surrounding developments, and get that visibility and those connections to other retail to sort of start to form those kinds of Main Street characteristics? And then, as Graham said, we want to ensure that nothing that we're going to propose is going to encourage, the need for additional right-of-way or anything that's going to affect the street design in a negative way. If anything, we want to try to narrow the street and increase the streetscape elements and kind of tighten everything up to make it. And I'm going to show some pictures of that. So, Catherine, if it's okay, maybe I'll just keep going here.
That's fine. That's
okay.
fine.
So the next layer in thinking about this urban environment is public spaces, and we want to think about the needs of the on-site residents, the people who are going to who live there, and people who work at the site, but also think about what's missing from the larger community. Is there certain types of parks or experiences that the larger community is desiring and would see this as a destination or desirable place to come to meet that kind of need? And when we talk about public space, we're talking about not just the bigger parks, but also the small urban plazas and frankly, the street design. Our streets can be our greatest public space assets. So some of those elements are accessible and connected. I'm going to talk next about the importance of them being part of a network. Thinking about those activities to meet diverse community needs, safety, sociability. How do they get used in the day and night? So this is just an example of of an open space network. This is Tyson's Corner, and the dark green are what was open space prior to the plan, or in the early stages of the plan. And as it's starting to get implemented, you can see all of the planned park spaces. Now, I recognize our site is a lot smaller, 27.5 acres versus several hundred acres, but you see the concept being woven together here, that you have trails and bike facilities that help to knit all of these public spaces together. And that you can see this range of sizes. You have some larger, more natural park spaces that maybe even part of stream valleys, versus some smaller, much more urban parks that are often surrounded around buildings. But the importance of an open space network, besides giving opportunities for connecting all of these things together and increasing accessibility, is that they serve important environmental purposes as well. They help restore ecological functions and create habitat by connecting all of these spaces together. And as part of that, thinking about the county established about a decade ago the Urban Parks Framework, which is to say that our standards for park space in generally in the county were more suburban in nature. We thought about, single family neighborhoods and what kinds of park spaces would be needed for that, but we have to think about it differently in urban areas. The same standards for amount of space and things just can't be achieved in these very urban areas. Again, we're talking about 27.5 acres on the Huntington station site, and and some of that is topography and conservation areas. So we want to make sure that we're concentrating our activity in certain places and thinking about this diverse range of park spaces to have different experiences, but doing it at a scale that's appropriate for an urban environment. So I've talked a little bit about this, but the importance of building design, in that case, we're talking about the exterior, or the envelope of the building. And elements that are important to that are how the building meets the street and that relationship between the building and the space around it. We really want to focus on that ground floor activity and what happens where the building meets the ground. And as I mentioned, parking is such a critical element of that, so that we know if we can design around the parking, which sounds so crazy, but we can figure out where that parking can best get hidden. We can really make the best out of the streets that we really want to highlight. So these are a little bit older numbers. I actually had reached out to Street Sense, and he had told me Wednesday that he would get back to me. So that's one day too late, but it's okay. This gives an order of magnitude, and these are 2013 numbers. But really what it's showing is that as you go higher in scale, obviously the cost per square foot goes up, because you're going from a low-rise building that can be often built with all wood frame to sometimes a mid-rise, which is often a sort of hybrid, where you have the bottom 2 floors, 1 or 2 floors as concrete, and then what happens above that is all stick construction, because the building code allows for up to 5 stories done in wood construction, which is obviously the least expensive. When you start to get to concrete and steel, it's more money. So, but we've gotten creative in that we can have this sort of hybrid approach where you have a couple of floors of concrete, and then you put your wood framed building on top of that concrete. And that is less expensive than when you go to high rise. But in this case, because we're at a metro station, we really want to maximize and make the most of these footprints, because we really don't have as much space. And metro stations are such a commodity. I mean, I think about the land around the metro station as this, it's finite. There's only so much space around each metro station that you can, that can help to build that neighborhood and that walkable experience. Because going back to that 5-minute or 10-minute walk, there's only just so much space around there, so we really want to maximize it. And we hope that there is the values to going taller in the long run. So especially at the Huntington Station, context and transitions are very vital because we want to have compatible designs with the surrounding neighborhood. And if we do that, we can create an experience that encourages walking and biking and that level of connectivity. So this just shows how you know, we can use the design and the density of buildings to start to transition either up or down towards neighborhoods. This is a couple of examples in Arlington. Arlington has a ton of really great examples of showing how, you know, you might have a 5-story building on one side of the street, and they want to ultimately get up to maybe an 8-story building, but they don't want to just have that 8-story building on the other side of the street. So in an example like this on the upper right, you see how they carried that same building height across the street and then started to step and taper it up. And we can do that. On the left side is another example where they taper up towards the transit station and then taper down towards the existing residential neighborhood. And you can do that successfully within a block. So with that, we'll talk in the plan about building step backs and step downs to sculpt that experience. And as I've talked about with parking, it's while we would love to see all of the parking be put underground, it's a very difficult proposition unless you are in the most urban parts of cities. And even then it's difficult because of costs. So we have to get creative and clever about how we hide parking, how we integrate it within the building blocks, and how we disperse it using on-street parking and maybe a little bit underground. So again, I went back a couple of years ago and got costs of parking based on different types. And I just bring this out there because it's so important to have a sense of the magnitude of scale when you're talking about the difference in costs of a surface parking space versus above ground versus underground. It is wildly different cost. So doing things like integrating the parking within the buildings, as I mentioned, you know, these examples of just doing superficial screening or no screening at all really don't help to build that human-centered experience versus, you know, maybe some really well done architectural treatments or even screening, putting the parking behind the building itself and putting the uses that actually help to buffer between the parking and the street. So this is stuff we do talk about in the plan as strategies. We might not put all these images in, but we certainly talk about the importance of these kinds of elements often within planning processes. So I already mentioned a little bit about the building types, but you can, when you hear the term a garden apartment often doesn't incorporate parking within that structure. Wrapped, or sometimes people call it a Texas donut, or kind of a crude term, a stack and wrap, but it's this idea that you're stacking the residential around a prefab parking garage. So these are often like their sizes are predetermined, and they bring all of the kit of parts out to the site and they just assemble this parking garage out on site. And then build around it. That's the cheapest way to do a parking garage. Then you have a podium style where you might have, you could have retail or other things on the ground floor, but the parking is integrated within the building. And that is typically a custom style parking garage that's built as part of the structure of the building. And the parking often takes up much of the footprint of the building block. And similarly with high-rise construction, a similar podium style. Some of that could be underground. So getting into this street design, this idea of priority streets is an important one. This is on the left, an example from the West Falls Church Metro Station site that EYA is developing. In fact, they're going to the Board of Food Supervisors tonight on that site, the one that's in the city, the county part of it. But you know, they looked at focusing all of their energy on one critical street that would connect all the way eventually to the metro station itself, but putting all their retail energy, rather than dispersing it and and putting it on all of the footprints of buildings, concentrating it on this one street and making that the center of activity. And I think that could be a strategy that we'd want to at least consider where we want to have retail, and if we want to create sort of concentrated areas of activity where we can have retail. Versus B Street might be a typical residential neighborhood, and then a C Street can be an opportunity actually for concentrating and putting a lot of our utilitarian uses, so that we're not mixing, garage entrances across from a residential home or something like that, where, we're concentrating those utilitarian things to alleys or side streets. It's just I think some examples of ways that buildings often engage and interact with the street itself to kind of build that experience. And we talk about the space between the sidewalk and the building as the building zone. Oh, sorry, duplicate slide there. And then this is a image from design guidelines that we have for a lot of our revitalization districts, including Richmond Highway, that shows sort of all the elements that we want to incorporate. And so as we were starting to talk a little bit about Huntington and North Kings, as well as any new streets that get developed within the transit station itself, I want to think about all of these elements that go into the street, because this really sort of recenters a street on humans and people versus cars. Right now, if you look at North Kings, there's very few of these elements. Few places where there's street trees. There's not even street lights on North Kings, portions of it, let alone a lot of the furnishings and elements that help to build that sense of place for the pedestrian. I like to say, it's like they're enclosed, so that they're not right up against the moving vehicles. But look at all of these layers between the car in the travel lane to the person on the sidewalk. You've got a bike lane, although we're moving bike lanes off street now in a lot of cases. But you've got a parking lane. You've got this landscape panel and amenity zone, and finally the pedestrian. And lastly, I wanted to mention the importance of sustainable design. I think a lot of it kicked off with this Oahe principles that was developed in California for resource efficient communities, that takes on a lot of placemaking features, but looks at how communities can develop sustainably. And that, when we talking about sustainable design, we're talking about stormwater, habitat creation and preservation, tree preservation, energy and energy efficiency. And we often in our comprehensive plan have sections that not only talk about stormwater management, but also green buildings such as LEED or other certification programs. So let me jump quickly. Before we move on, does anyone have any other thoughts that on sort of these general topics on urban design? All right.
Hey, Joanne, hi. Tim Sargent. I had one question, and as you look at the blocks in design, and you provided examples of, I think, like Del Rey and Old Town, and think which are good examples of areas that develop over time. Mm-hmm. How would you compare that with what we're looking at in terms of Huntington or even the Embark Richmond it looks at design in a current consistent state. How would that differ? And that's what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we want to take the best of these principles of good design, like, thinking about, well, what makes a walkable block size, and say, all right, well, if a 200 to 400 foot size block is a good one, as an example from Del Rey, then let's utilize that principle or that standard on our site. But I also think that great places are developed over time, and I hope that this is something that continues to evolve and and isn't. It's going to take years and years to build out. I mean, I recognize Delray took 100 years, but we're just taking the best of the experience and not trying to transfer it or translate it, but looking at those standards and seeing what could be applied to the site.
That may be something to share as we move forward, because it's in contemporary design, it's often hard for us to envision. I'll take Tyson's as an example. It's hard for us to envision the evolution over time.
Mm-hmm.
So how you make that evolution or leave space or time for that evolution to occur is a tough thing to understand. So that's helpful to kind of remind us.
I actually think that that's a big part of this Eisenhower plan. So let me bring this up, because what's so fascinating about this is that I think it ties in very well to what you're talking about. It was originally planned in the 70s. I hope everyone can recognize our site is directly across the Beltway. Huntington Avenue is right here, cut off on the screen, but and our site's right down here. And so it's the next metro station up from us, Eisenhower East. And after the 70s planning efforts, they had a first small area plan approved in the early 2000s, like 2003. And that was driven by Hoffman and the Carlisle development. Well, so here we are almost 20 years later, and they just approved last year in 2020 a new plan. And they learned a lot from the first small area plan 20 years ago, and now they're updating it. And by doing that, they're actually adding more density, more building height, and a whole lot more flexibility. So I think it's an example of starting with some good bones, but then building upon it. So I think the idea that we're going to get all of this right and figure it all out in one go is probably unrealistic, but at least we can set up the framework and the structure as it develops. So this was the original 2003 plan and how it laid out. It included it was actually quite progressive at the time. It included parking maximums and building height minimums, and it required a certain mix of uses. And it was fortunate in that there was only a dozen or so owners in all of these blocks for the 230 acres. So it's almost 10 times the size of our site, but we're also fortunate in that we have very few owners here.
I think you've just reminded us of the value of the area plans, which is a good thing.
What was beautiful about their plan update is they looked at these 8 core principles of looking at how to build community and affordable housing strategy, this flexibility, but then focusing on flexibility, design, and density throughout the plan. So they were trying to achieve a 50-50 balance of people living and working in the community. And instead of just focusing on, square footages and FAR, they said, how many people do we want to have living here, and how many people do we want to have working here? And then sort of worked backwards from there. As part of the design in this iteration, they thought about the Eisenhower East into two neighborhoods. And they did that in part because there's 2 metro stations. You have King Street at one end and Eisenhower at the other. And so, what made the 2 neighborhoods distinctive and unique? The one around the Eisenhower Avenue, they still wanted to require some amount of commercial, but they lowered the requirements. So what you can see here is the areas immediately around the metro station had a 60% minimum requirement for commercial. The ones that are in dark blue had already developed out as commercial. And then from there it tapers off to only a 30% requirement for commercial, and then total flexibility in the yellow and black dot areas of could be residential, could be commercial. The other thing that's kind of interesting on this is the areas that are highlighted in red outlines are the retail focus areas. So what they said is, you know, we don't want to spread our retail out. We know that people are trying to go to destinations. They want to, retail wants to be around other retail. And so let's focus our energy onto these two concentrated cores. So those are their, when you look at their street design, you'll see those are their A streets. I think what's also fascinating about the plan is that they carried forward the idea of building height minimums. You can see these are pretty significant building heights, ranging from 100 at the lowest for minimum building height and all the way up to 400 at the metro stations. And then their minimums are half of their maximums. And so, as I was saying, this idea of the A street, B street, C street concept, they said, of course, Eisenhower, a lot like Lynn, what you were talking about, what you mentioned about the importance of creating better street designs rather than, focusing on car throughput. They are refocusing efforts on Eisenhower. They have a similar problem we do. Eisenhower is just too wide for it to be a good retail main street. But they're looking at strategies now of ways to narrow that road or, encourage more activity along it. And then focusing again around those core areas. So just, I think, some interesting examples of what they want to achieve within the their open space. They have a portion of Hunting Creek that comes through the site, and they're playing that up and using that environmental features to their advantage to both do restoration and have the community engage with it. I think the architecture is really well done overall in Eisenhower. They have really great urban design standards. They do a lot with transitions. What I've heard from when you look at criticisms of the area, there isn't a whole lot of energy. There's a lack of evening population. And so creating that balance of residents to workers is going to be really important to building that. What I heard in terms of criticisms and reading articles was that there's a lack of central gathering space, even in the new plan, and that people saw that as a critical way to building that center and that energy. Is having one space that people can go to. They said that Carlisle over by the movie theater, it's too isolated from the rest of these neighborhoods. And because of the way that Huntington fits within the neighborhood, I wanted to bring up this idea again about building height transitions. And I just thought that this example at Park Meridian was a really good one in the way that they worked to start to taper down to the residential neighborhoods, and then building up. The metro station is right here on the other side of this building. Oh yeah, I already mentioned the criticisms, but you can see there's a lot of vacant retail in there, and I think that's in part because it lacks a significant residential population. So I am talking a lot. I did want to just jump into a little bit the Huntington, some of the bigger ideas about the Huntington design and things that we should all be considering. So as I've talked about, how we build out a street network, both in the streets that surround the development, but also within it, developing a system, a network of park spaces, plazas and squares, and then the land uses and building architecture that help to build that that character and sense of place. So I just thought as an urban designer, when I start to think about creating a development design for a place, I first look at the context. And so I just thought I'd pull up some pictures of the surrounding neighborhoods. I think Jefferson Manor and Huntington neighborhoods are really beautiful and are great examples of post-war developments that really are well-preserved and vibrant communities that we should see as important assets to the Huntington neighborhood in general. Some more pictures of Montebello Apartments nearby. I know, Lynn, I think you live there, and it's a beautiful set of buildings and important context. And when we think about how this metro station will fit into both the smaller scale single family as well as the larger condos and denser apartment buildings. And I'm sure this has come up, but the Huntington Club, which is directly adjacent to the site to the north, if you can see, I don't know if you all are seeing my pointer, so let me just make sure that it's here. But this is the metro station site, and Huntington Club is immediately to the north of it, and it is undergoing a rezoning right now to look at a much broader, a much denser development with apartments, condos, potentially assisted living, stacked townhouses, some retail, office. I mean, the full gamut of uses, very similar to a lot of the things we're talking about on the metro station site. And they also are dealing with a lot of similar challenges regarding topography and figuring out how to phase this development.
Joanne, this is Gretchen.
Yeah.
They just presented, IDI presented to us last month at Planning and Zoning.
Okay, great.
We've seen this whole project.
Yeah, I'm definitely not gonna take.
Just thought I'd let you know that.
Yeah, good. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the historical context is also important. In doing a little bit of research, it's actually fascinating. The site has gone through a major evolution. It was the site of the Mount Eagle Plantation, which is where the name of a lot of the school and Mount Eagle Park get its name from, dating back to the late 1700s. And this plantation was located much closer to the Mount Eagle Park, where the Mount Eagle Park is today. This map shows the location of Fort Lyon, which is where the metro station now sits. And it was a very strategic fort during the Civil War because this is one of the highest points south of Alexandria. It helped to control Huntington Creek. It controlled Little River Turnpike, some of the railroads that ran through here. And I think that it really illustrates that it was this key center because of its strategic topography. And I think it's something that we should be thinking of as a really great asset and something very unique to capitalize on. And then, of course, Metro opened in the early 1980s. So the last thing I'll mention about the site features themselves is, as we know, the extreme topography. And this was a graphic that Graham shared last week, but I just think it bears repeating. 130-foot difference across the site is radical. So when we think about the southern portion of the site versus the northern portion of the site, do we want to see it connect? And if so, how are we going to do that? Because conventional methods of just overlaying a street network over top of this is not going to be feasible. There's no way to really mitigate that grade. The way that they do it now is obviously through this center parking garage. You can enter in at the bottom, circulate through, and come out to the top. In fact, Huntington Club is employing a similar strategy in one of their development blocks to connect between streets. So I'm not saying that's the best solution, but we're going to have to be very creative if we want to see that connectivity. So I hope to open up the discussion now to more broadly to the whole group in talking about some of these, but I thought I'd pose some questions to the group. In giving this brief background and everything that you experience as a resident of this area, what do you all see as some positive attributes of the Huntington community? Not just the site, but the general area. An example could be its rich history. So.
Near the Krispy Kreme.
Did you say Krispy Kreme?
You heard that?
So, Joanne, this is Holly Doherty.
Yeah.
So I think Huntington Avenue has the potential to become a great walkable street.
Mm.
You know, just the way it is right now, you know, 2 lanes, you've got a sidewalk. You know, if there were better amenities or destinations there, I think that could become a great walkable area.
Okay. Is it in part? I mean, I think it's great that it's got some little small. It's got some retail on it now, and a pretty big mix of housing types. So you've got a pretty diverse neighborhood adjacent to it. So there's almost already that mix of uses beginning to happen.
Yeah. So this is Mary. I used to live in one of the duplexes. Hi. Trying to start the video. I don't know if that's working. I'm having trouble today with the technology. Anyway, I used to live on Victory Drive, just a block off Huntington Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love the walkability of it, walking over to the metro. And I wish there were more retail. I mean, there was some of the service places I still go back to use, the hair cuttery, the dry cleaner, some of the restaurants. That was really nice to have that all walkable, and I hope we have more of that in the area. And I don't know how you do it, but it's good if the retail can be useful retail, so that people actually can walk to them to get their needs met, their daily needs met, rather than having you know, flying pig figurines in the shop. It's better to have you know, some carry out or dry cleaner or hair cutters, or, you know, things that you need, things that are useful. I don't know how you encourage that to happen in the retail, but I think that's what kind of brings a community together, because you go, you know, to the same haircut place and you meet people. And there's also some little community centers in there, kind of hidden away, one back in the Huntington area, and another one a little farther away. But those are very interesting because the kids can gather there and do things and have events and recreation and whatnot. And I think that area along the Hunting Creek is developing nicely as a walk along it. It used to be kind of raggedy when I lived there, but I think that's a big feature of the area, is being able to go down to the creek and walk along a trail there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you raised, and unfortunately, I wish this slide extended over there. The upper top right corner is the edge of it, but Cameron Run is, as all the developments along it are building out, from Riverside over a North Gateway all the way up to Huntington here, where the county saw the opportunity to put trails and park spaces along it. And so it will actually eventually connect the entire thing together across all of Cameron Run. And I think that's a really important asset that, from an environmental standpoint, that we want to connect to or think about, you know, how does this neighborhood tie to that? But I love the way you described it, the retail. You know, the term in the comp plan would be like neighborhood serving retail versus destination retail. You know, the dry cleaners, the pizza joint, that sort of thing.
Hey, Joanne, as you see this view of the area, you see perhaps the need for more connectivity. And how do you achieve that based on existing development?
Right. I mean, that's as I was mentioning with topography, there's no connection in all of this between North Kings and Huntington, the two key streets in the area. And so, you know, the need to make that cross connection. I mean, Huntington Club will have a street that connects. It kind of comes, but if it's all the way up here, sort of at the northern corner of the site, and it loops around and then connects back So that's pretty far still. And when we talk again, we talked about those walkable blocks. You know, this is far too separated and too big. So do others think that that's an important need to find a connection
really
between
is.
Huntington? Yeah.
Isn't there
Yeah.
going to be a walkability between Huntington and they've got, through some, nice park-like areas over to where the Huntington development, the new metro development is going to be, where Avonton is and where the new one is coming in. I was pretty sure we had a walkway through there so that people from the neighborhood wouldn't have to go all the way down. Isn't that
Yes.
true? Okay.
Avonton has trails that run through it to connect the neighborhoods of Montebello and to the south up to the metro station, and there's even a circulator that runs over. But I think there's also the question of connecting Huntington to North Kings.
Well, I think that's true. But there's stuff in between. But there is from the top of Biscayne, or the southern end of Biscayne. I'm pretty sure there's a walkway.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's like right here. There's a series of steps.
Yeah,
It's difficult because it's a lot of steps, but you got to be healthy.
Well, if you've looked at Biscayne Drive, it goes straight up. So people who live there are used to that.
So, Joanne, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I know you touched briefly on Kings Highway. Now, I know that when the BRT is put in, that there are some changes that will happen to part of Kings Highway when the BRT comes out of Huntington Metro and goes down to Richmond Highway. But that seems to me an area that really needs an emphasis on walkability.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's if you go down there on garbage day, everybody's got their garbage can out on the sidewalk, and you can't walk on the sidewalk.
Right.
And people have to put their garbage somewhere. But it things like that make it really difficult to walk, to say if you're at the new South Alex development or
up to this area.
Right. And even though it's a fourth of a mile from there to the metro, you just don't see anybody walking on that area.
That's perfect.
Yeah, agreed. And part of it is, this experience. I mean, you're right up against the road, up against a 4-lane road. You've got a 2-foot grass strip and then a very narrow sidewalk. And, just frankly don't feel that comfortable. And so I think that this is a huge opportunity to rethink what the street looks like. I just showed an example below of, because I anticipated this part of the conversation, that this is a similar width street. And again, this is just a rendering, but look at all of these layers and things that can happen between the moving cars and the people on the sidewalk to create a very comfortable experience. And then, of course, the buildings being pushed up against that sidewalk to create that sense of engagement and activity. So it's all of these elements working together, and we have that opportunity on the site because of I think the chance here of how the a lot of the infrastructure can get reoriented. So I did want to talk a little bit about that opportunity to move some of these things. In a lot of other metro stations, and maybe I'll just go back, like Vienna, for example, when you exit the metro station, you're greeted with all of the kiss and ride lot, the bus bays, all of those elements, which really doesn't help engage you with the developments that are around it. There's a few examples in the suburban areas where that's different, and one of them is Bethesda. Bethesda has you come out into the Metro Plaza at Bethesda Station, and that's because a lot of the infrastructure sits below that plaza. And because of the way the topography works on our site, we actually have the opportunity to redirect all of that infrastructure, hopefully, at the metro entrance below the parking garage deck and hide all of that so we can actually make all of the land adjacent to North Kings be developable blocks. I think that is one of the biggest opportunities that I can think of in a long time around a metro station. So we really should take advantage of that opportunity. It sounds like something that WMATA could be willing to do. So, I just showed an example of, this is, again, you come out from the Dunloring metro station and this is what you're greeted with. The bus bays, the parking garage entrance, it's loud, it's all vehicle oriented. And I think that, we have the chance at our site to think about it differently and put that stuff undergrade like at Bethesda, and then utilize all of that space and create that street level experience for North Kings. Let me see, where was I? I've jumped around now. So one of the other elements that I wanted to talk through is, this idea of, hopefully we can get some kind of network connectivity at the street level between North Kings and Huntington. I also think that it's important to think about connectivity between Huntington Club itself and the transit station area. I mean, if this is undergoing redevelopment, we certainly have an opportunity to look at these two sites together and say, is there a chance to connect these streets and create a larger grid within this whole area, and ensuring that both the street design, the public space design, and the buildings of both of those developments work well together. When Abington came in, and the smaller site down here, we thought through that at that time, and that's how we ended up, as you said, Ellen, with connections through the site, because we knew where this was headed, and we wanted to think about how the street network could ultimately lay out with Abington. So I think we have that chance now with Huntington Club. So I was thinking about, do we see these as two sort of distinctive areas, the southern part of the site and the northern part of the site, or do we see it as one development? Sounds like it may be phased differently because of the parking garages and the need to retain them over time versus ones that can be disposed of earlier. But what do you guys think about the fact that the site is almost bifurcated so distinctively? Do you see it as, is the Jefferson neighborhood and North Kings very different than the characteristics along Huntington, for example?
Not really. I mean, I know people who live in, this is Gretchen, I know people who live in both communities, and they have very similar demographics, and yeah, they're just, I think the problem for them is that they don't get left behind, like have all these great projects, but nothing segues to help either one of those communities.
And do you have any ideas about what those are?
For the whole projects. What?
Right. A lot of times things like not just connectivity from the neighborhoods to the site is important, but also like open spaces, as I mentioned. We have Mount Eagle Park. There's the park within Jefferson Manor. But what kinds of park, and I'm sorry, Cameron Run Trail network that's going to build out. But, often the metro stations are seen as the sort of center of a community, and how can we build that center at the station? Do we see this as the center of the community, or the potential to create that, where this is the place where all of these different neighborhoods can come together? And what would that look like? Is that a central park that becomes this hub for people? Is it the neighborhood serving retail that Mary was talking about? What are those elements?
You know, if you go out to Wheelie Metro Station, have you been out there, Joanne?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have business colleagues out that way, and if I go to their offices, and then we walk these long tunnels and bridges to get over everything, including the Beltway or the 66 or whatever earth it is, you're up above all the smaller stuff. But what I found interesting the last time I was out there was that there's restaurants, there's places within these transit walking areas that people can go and hang out.
Mm-hmm.
That may or may not fit here. And as Gretchen mentioned, one of the other issues is that when retailers come in to put in a restaurant at a metro station, let's say, the price point doesn't necessarily fit the demographics. Now, not all people that live in these row houses are on the, the hourly rate. I mean, we've got architect friends who live over there and
Sure.
people of that sort that make a pretty hefty chunk of change. They just like where they live. But I think you have to be very cautious with that. Unless you put in parks and food trucks, then I think you hurt the smaller neighborhoods. So that may be something to think about. You do parks, you do food truck offerings, because that'll also make the people happy that work there. I mean, look at, if you go down into DC, when the food trucks line up on 7th Street
Yeah.
or 14th Street, oh
Yeah.
my God, it's a madhouse.
It's insane. Yeah.
And I think we ought to think about more of that around here. So anyhow,
Well,
that's my 2
did you
cents.
ever see Wheelie before it was fully built out? They did
yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
temporary
Yes.
businesses. So
Yes.
for others who don't know, when you left the Wheelie Avenue metro station, before all of the development was finished, they had a whole series of these little kiosks, small businesses, local businesses that were selling really interesting things. There was a used bookstore. There was a honey pot store. It was just really, there was a barbecue joint. And it really started to build that sense of community before, we got fully built out. So that whole concept of, we need to think about this as a place built over time.
Yes.
Yeah. And kind of building that energy. But I do think that it sounds like, based on a lot of what you're hearing, that, there could be some limited retail. We really have to be cautious about the amount of retail that we want to consider because of how it's so radically changing. But if we concentrate, if we knowing that Huntington Club is developing some amount of retail along Huntington Avenue, well, then we really do want to think about what happens along Huntington Avenue on this site to carry that down. And I think in that way, really start to build a main street out of it, because we can carry it across sites. Similarly, on North Kings, you've got the shopping center across the street. Pretty successful. I think there's some opportunity for tying into that and creating a little bit of a neighborhood district associated with that retail.
Well, you also have an opportunity to actually establish pop-up shops. And I don't know if you do that by putting a plaza in where the pop-up shops can come on a regular basis, a covered pavilion where they can come and they switch out and change out based on what's the hot topic of the month or who's out there, artist areas to paint, but it becomes a permanent pop-up area. So, we have to think beyond I'm going to zone a 9x9 building and it's going to be like this, and we're going to get a lease for a vendor to come in and and then the landlord wants to jack the price to $65 a square foot, and then nobody shows up at the mattress store. I mean, that's what's happened along Richmond Highway. And my bugaboo on that is what happened at the Beacon at Groveton. So we need to be, you guys at the staff level need to be very, very careful on what happens, or we're going to get more of that. Because the landlord's going to charge what the landlords are going to charge.
Right. I found really interesting. Have you watched with Bonchon Chicken going into the Beacon at Groveton? have you noticed that people actually park? There's some striped off area right on Richmond Highway, and people park in front of Bonchon Chicken right on Richmond Highway and use it like on-street parking to run in and get their orders. And that's such so telling to me that you need to have that street experience to have those if you're going to have a business that fronts right on the roadway.
Well, you do.
Yeah. And so we need to think about that. If we want to have businesses on North Kings, boy, maybe we need to figure out how to put some on-street, high turnover parking spaces on it or right adjacent to it on a side street.
Absolutely.
Same with Huntington Avenue.
Yeah.
We're going to have retail right here on Huntington Club all the way up to this corner.
Yeah.
And then we got the tracks, and then what happens on the other side. In fact, I wanted to share the Eisenhower plan was thinking about the tracks as well. And so, here, this is Huntington Avenue on the left. This is Huntington Club here, and this is the metro station site. I mean, this is a really cool opportunity. This is what Eisenhower is considering. On the upper right is Toronto has created something called Bentway Park, which I actually got to go to a club underneath underneath the metro tracks, and how creative and cool that is. I mean, it's great. It's covered outdoor space, So I just think there's a lot of opportunities for us to think, like you're saying, pop up, creative, different, that takes advantage of these unique moments on the site.
Yep.
So I know we're getting close to the end of time, but I also just did want to talk about some of the constraints and challenges. And I think we've already touched on some of that with the street design and the need to get that right. But I think there are some other challenges. I should just go back and mention about topography. Topography to me is both an opportunity and a challenge. I mean, this view, getting back to Fort Lyon and the fact that this site was so coveted as a strategic location, we really need to think about that as a great opportunity. And this is the view from the top of the parking garage, which certainly can create awesome opportunities for the private residents or businesses that would occupy the buildings that would have this view. But what do we do for the people? What do we do for the public? How can we capitalize on this topography and these views for the general public? Does that lead to really thinking about public space in a more vertical fashion? Are there opportunities for rooftop, for stepping and tapering the buildings down to maximize the number of people that get this view?
Yeah, Joan, I think that's a great thought. I love to go to the Masonic Memorial just to get up to the top of the observation deck and look around, or to go to the stairs there on the Masonic Memorial, and you can look out across the river and see Maryland. It's a great view, and those are wonderful experiences to have.
Yeah, and the top of this parking garage, I don't know if anyone has ever had to park up there. You leave your car and take the metro for the whole day. When you come back, you need to stand outside your car with the doors open for at least 15 minutes, or you'll scorch yourself getting. So it would be a great opportunity. I mean, it's just barren, and it feels so much more welcoming if we had, some kind of little pocket park or some trees up there. A green roof in some places. I mean, it's just kind of wasted.
Yeah. Couldn't you imagine just a whole series of green roofs sort of stepping down?
I wish the county would just insist on every roof having to be green. I mean, it would and in the buildings where there are little restaurants, you can have gardens up there, and it helps with food supply. I mean, in apartments, people can grow their own herbs on the top of high rises. I just think all roofs should probably be green for visual and for the environment.
Yeah. The county just released, I think it was the county, somebody released a heat island index mapping of the whole county. if anybody saw the article on this, but it's pretty fascinating because if you look at new developments versus old developments, like for example, Mosaic District, it's a cool spot right in the middle of Merrifield. And that's in part because we're doing a much better job these days at addressing those heat island impacts and creating green roofs and lessening that type of heat impact. So I think that certainly can be employed here. One of the reasons, Ellen, that it's hard to do green roofs is we're going back to that stick construction. It's virtually impossible to do a green roof on stick construction. So that's part of.
Excuse me. Wait a minute. I'm going to argue with you on that. Number one, that is not true. Not true at all. Structurally, engineering wise and otherwise, one of my best friends owns the largest green roof company in the world. And he was just at my house and told me how I can convert my house into complete green roof. So please, please, Joanne, do not be sending falsehood around.
Well,
yes, you have to do some more architectural stuff to do it, but it is doable.
Yeah, but you're one story, Catherine. We're talking.
No, Ellen, it is doable. The man does this all over the world. He's getting ready to do a whole bunch of stuff with the county. So please be careful what you say.
Okay, well, you heard it here, folks. We can do green roofs on stick-built construction. It's one of the other reasons to insist on things like, higher rise, high density buildings, because the more, one of the things that we're challenged with right now in new developments that are coming in the general area is people want to stick with lower density developments that are more land consumptive, that don't go to those higher rise buildings. And you can see places like the Eisenhower East Plan that are insisting on it because they want that really high quality architecture, that high quality materials, and the best way to get that is with those higher density, higher rise buildings. And then that maximizes the ground plane for the great public spaces rather than, maximizing a building footprint. So I think those are really important considerations on such a constrained site like this one.
Well, when I think of Huntington, this is David, I do think it's pretty heavy with roadways and traffic. I think about the bridge over to Eisenhower Avenue. I mean, it just feels very, like you said, constrained, but I think with a lot of roadways. I think in that sort of setting, what works well is to cut out sort of protected space for pedestrians. That you have a parkway or a green space that they can access and use. Yeah, like that photo you had there. A great example of that is Quincy Market up in Boston. It's fantastic because it's in downtown Boston. It's in the midst of heavily traveled roads, heavily trafficked roads, and they created this this space. Really, it's a pedestrian space with retail. It's a commercial site, retail and commercial, but it just works so well because it just really is appealing and people want to go there.
Yes, that's that kind of destination moment that I think would be great to achieve here. I was just going back to this. Gosh, sorry to keep jumping around. Just wanted to go back to that street design.
You had mentioned the Heat Island study that has just been done for the whole county. Is that available? Can you give us a link on where that's available, please?
Yeah, for sure. I'll give the link to Erin to send out. It's like it's an interactive mapping, so you can
great.
zoom
And
around.
With that being said, it's not just rooftops that create heat island.
Oh, for sure.
There is a study, and I apologize, I can't remember when it was done, but it wasn't that long ago, by the EPA, if I remember correctly, that speaks to roadways. And the more we pave, the more we widen, i.e. Richmond Highway, North Kings Highway, the more heat island. And the fact of the matter is the majority of those kinds of things are very impactful on those of us less fortunate because they mostly live in and on these roadways. So I think the county needs to start considering that when we, and I'm going to push on this, when we allow VDOT to do what they're recommending for the Richmond Highway widening. Enough said.
We can say a lot
Agreed.
more on that. It's not enough said. We can talk for hours on it if you want, but it really is important.
It is. It definitely is. Just there's also a lot to talk about with Hunting, but I totally agree. We need to get the streets right. Without getting the streets right, you're never. I mean, you know, this is just a case in point. Seeing these two images side by side here, you know, this you feel like a second class, third class citizen walking down the sidewalk on, you know, in front of the metro station today. You know, I don't feel comfortable with that. Mike, you know, if I'm walking with my daughter, I'm going to put her on the other side of the sidewalk away from the cars for fear that somebody, an errant vehicle, is going to hit us. You know, on the bottom image, you're slowing the traffic. You're making spaces for all people. You're lowering the heat island effect, as you said, Catherine, by adding all of these street trees. And you're creating that sense of enclosure for pedestrians where would they feel as important in this space as the cars. The top image, only the cars feel important there. So 100% we need to get this right. And we need to make sure that, you know, one of the things that's always often a challenge with developers is that there's a focus on thinking inward on the site. You know, they have control over the street typically inside the development because they get to design both sides of the road. They get to think about how the street width and all of those parts and pieces that make up that street life experience. And then sometimes that results in kind of turning their back to the bigger streets that surround the development. And I think we need to ensure that there's priority placed on these two roads. It sounds like everybody is sort of on that page that we need to figure out how this station site can get integrated into the neighborhood, not turn its back, not feel like it's been plugged into the neighborhood, but that it's, as you said Walter, earlier, that it's more organically integrated. And that can be done, you know, by looking strategically at the intersections. You know, I think it's going to be important to prioritize you know, the existing intersections and how do those connect into the metro station development? I mean, in some way that sort of starts to set up a grid, at least on the southern portion of the site, as to where intersections and roads could connect into the development. So in fact, maybe does anyone want to add anything before we wrap up?
Joanne, I just had a thought. I'm wondering, as the Huntington area develops, if there's any thought of providing some space for historical monuments or, you know, anything to kind of recall or pull out, emphasize the Civil War history of that site. That might make it a more interesting site if there were some public spaces that did that.
You know, we could incorporate some public artwork there too. A lot of places around the country, you know, use artwork to kind of bring neighborhoods together. And it can be artwork or it can be permanent artwork, and it can have historical, you know, significance too. I'm a big fan. And Joanne, as you know, we're working on getting some murals, you know, done along the Richmond Highway corridor. And so, I mean, things like that. I think would be hugely helpful in bringing the community.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think, as you're saying, Holly, you know, looking back at that history, and, you know, we want to embrace those characteristics and the elements like the topography and this importance of this site, why it was so important to begin with, but then remembering that past, you know, whether it be through art, through public space design. You know, right now there's a historical marker that marks Fort Lyon at the metro station, but that's, you know, yes, that's important for historical, you know, remembering, but integrating ideas into the public space makes it a lot more authentic and memorable. So I totally agree with you. We need to get creative. In fact, Avonton is proffered as part of their redevelopment here at the southern portion of the site, quite a bit of public art in their development. So and we encourage them to look at the history and neighborhoods for context when looking at that public art.
Could I make just one final comment, Joanne? And we need to talk at some point. I live in Montebello, and I've got lots of ideas about what we should be doing out in this neighborhood out here. But could you give me one favor that's just a little off the beaten path on this? Would you carry back to the staff that we're mad as hell about the latest VDOT and FCDOT coverage of the thing? We really are, and this is something that we had not. We know we keep seeing the pictures of the 6 lanes and such, which is fine. But then suddenly, when you really get it out in detail, it becomes 12 lanes. So we're really upset about it. And just if you just pass on that word, we'd appreciate it.
Yes, I know that Rachel Flynn, the Deputy County Exec, has been hot on this as well, and we've been looking for opportunities to reduce the number of things like turn lanes and intersection sizes, and making sure that we get all of these streetscape elements, the street trees. I mean, you could have a pretty wide boulevard, but if you have all of these great elements and buildings that begin to engage with it, and the bike lanes and all of that, it certainly does at least start to bridge some of those challenges. But you look at Wisconsin Avenue, it's a wide road, but it's got a very different set of characteristics because of the way that the buildings and the street design work together.
It's not 12 lanes.
Wisconsin Avenue, you mean, it's not?
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to beat that tonight. You've talked. It's been very helpful. Thank you very much. The briefing on the plannings and things I thought was terrific, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. I mean, I'd love to get back together. I'd love to do this in person and sit down with marker and pen and trace paper and really talk through ideas that you all have of how to make better connections, the types of public spaces that we think are important. But these are the kinds of things that we really should be focusing on, rather than saying, boy, should it be a 1.2 FAR or 1.25 FAR? That's not going to build community. Not saying those things aren't important. There's a place for that, but first we need to get the place right. That's my plug, Graham. For keeping me employed.
As Joanne would say, you heard it here first, folks.
We're not on mute.
Joanne, to follow up on that, what happened to all the offsites we've already done where we looked at every location? We had tons and tons of people and we put little stickies all over the place. What's happened to all of that research and everything?
Are you talking about for this site, or are you talking about for Embark?
No, for the entire Embark down the highway. This site was part of all of that. What happened to all that? North Gateway, all of it. Where's that stuff?
That all is codified between the comprehensive plan and the design guidelines for Richmond Highway, but we didn't talk about Huntington Metro Station when we did that, other than just, it's the Metro Station's relationship to the corridor, but not these designs.
Okay, so when do you want to do this? Because the comp plan changes, what WMATA has just looked at, what Abington has just looked at, what IDI is looking at, those are moving down the road lickety split. So when do you want to do what you want to do? So we do it seriously and codify it. Can't wait till after the fact, because then it's
Certainly. That's up to Graham and the team.
Yeah, so I mean, we can talk about it further. The thing that I would say is doing it in the virtual space. And I looked at Joanne in particular. She's been working on these kinds of things over the past year and a half. You know, it's challenging, especially with a group. Are going to be looking at hybrid meetings post Labor Day, and so you know we'll see what future agendas can hold, but I think there may be some opportunities to look at this topic once we get some people back into a room where we can actually interact with each other in person. So.
Isn't the intent right now, Graham, to start off by looking at all of these different layers, you know, land use, design, transportation, and sort of get all of these backgrounds? And if everybody collectively builds this knowledge base on all of these different issues, then at that point, Catherine, can come together and say, now that we have this collective understanding about all the various issues, let's put all these different ideas and layer them onto each other together to start to formulate a vision.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's correct. And I would just add that, you know, we have a couple of other topics that we're going to cover. In particular, we have transportation. We'll have a focused discussion on that next week. Then we'll have a pause for the August recess and then return back in September. And really in September, that's when we'll start talking about some of the first run impacts of the plan that we'll be looking at with all the county agencies and our partner agencies. So I mentioned that because we do have the urban design considerations, the transportation considerations, but there's a lot of other factors that'll come into play here that some of what we've mentioned today, specifically open space, park space, and others that we'll need to look at in particular with public facilities, schools, your more traditional infrastructure, stormwater, and water and stuff like that. So we'll have additional discussions about impacts and the other facets that we'll need to look at as part of the study. But yes, I think there will be some opportunities to kind of synthesize all that, especially once we're back in person, and at least most of us are back in person to discuss further. Looking forward to it.
So Graham, so the task force is going to have an opportunity to weigh in on the impacts, is what you're saying.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so we're looking at in September in particular is when we start looking at some of the impacts, given the board's authorization. So we have that quantification table that I had provided earlier on, which describes numerically what we're looking at from a land use scenario, kind of the FAR that Joanne mentioned. So our agencies can take a look at the impacts of the changes in land use as well as the intensities that are proposed compared to the base plan. They take a look at that and the impacts that are generated. So we'll have a discussion. We wanted to make sure that with this urban design considerations, them being very vital to TOD and transit-oriented development areas in the county, as well as transportation, making sure that we had a real solid discussion on both of those topics before we dive into impacts.
Okay. So you're gonna talk to us about how to quantify those impacts. That's like where you're gonna end up. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, should I turn it back over to the chairs?
So Joanne, thank you very much. Very impressive presentation. You've given us a lot to think about and very insightful, I believe. So thank you very much. That was great. So with that, I'll ask staff, Graham and Aaron, anything else we need to consider here for tonight? We have our next meeting is July 20th, next Tuesday. I hope everyone has that on their calendar. Anything else for the good of the group?
There are no public attendees tonight, so there's no need for public comment.
Okay, thank you. Good. So with that,
Motion to adjourn?
as for- do we have a second? Is there a second?
I second.
Moved and second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Nay?
Don't
Great,
count.
so.
That was great tonight, Joanne.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you guys. Thanks for indulging
Yes,
me.
thank you, Joanne.
Super job.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Just awesome.
Bye.
Good night.
I-